2 million children. That's how many kids were homeschooled in evangelical Christian families at the peak of the Christian homeschool movement in the early 2010s. 2 million children raised in a parallel educational universe, isolated from mainstream culture, taught that they were the faithful remnant preserving biblical Christianity. They were supposed to be the generation that took back America for Christ. The army of young people who would transform culture, lead the church, and prove that the Christian homeschool model produced superior citizens, better believers, and stronger families. Instead, they're leaving in massive numbers. A woman named Rachel sent me an email last month. She was homeschooled from kindergarten through 12th grade. Raised in what she calls the bubble where her curriculum was exclusively Christian. Her social life was church and homeschool co-ops, and her parents genuinely believed they were giving her the best possible education. She's 32 now. She hasn't attended church in 8 years. She describes her homeschool experience as educational neglect and spiritual abuse. She's in therapy working through the damage. And she says almost everyone she grew up with in the homeschool community has a similar story. Some left Christianity entirely. Some became progressive Christians their parents would consider heretical. A few stayed evangelical but refused to homeschool their own kids. Almost none turned out the way their parents hoped. She said we were supposed to be the chosen generation, the ones raised right, the success stories of Christian homeschooling. Instead, we're the cautionary tales. And our parents have no idea why we left or how badly they failed us. Multiply that story across the Christian homeschool movement. Thousands of young adults raised in the system now speaking out about their experiences. Blogs, podcasts, support groups, entire online communities of homeschool survivors processing trauma and deconstructing their upbringing. This isn't a few isolated cases. This is a generational exodus. The children of the Christian homeschool movement are rejecting everything their parents taught them. And they're doing it publicly, articulately, and in numbers large enough to represent a crisis. Today, we're investigating the homeschool exodus. What the Christian homeschool movement promised versus what it delivered. Why so many homeschool graduates are walking away from the faith. What went so catastrophically wrong. And what this reveals about the future of evangelical Christianity. If you want to understand one of the most significant failures in modern evangelical history, subscribe now. Because the homeschool exodus isn't just about education. It's about what happens when Christians create isolated subcultures that can't survive contact with the real world. To understand the exodus, you need to understand the vision that created the Christian homeschool movement. In the 1980s and 90s, conservative evangelicals became convinced that public schools were dangerous. They saw sex education, evolution, secular humanism, and absence of prayer as threats to their children's faith and values. Leaders like James Dobson, Michael Ferris, and the Duggar family promoted homeschooling as the solution. Pull your children out of corrupt public schools. Educate them at home with Christian curriculum. Raise them in a protected environment where faith is integrated into every subject. The promise was compelling. Your children would get superior education. They'd be sheltered from negative peer pressure, drugs, promiscuity, and secular ideology. They'd stay close to family. They'd develop strong faith because Christianity wouldn't be compartmentalized but woven into daily life. Homeschool advocates pointed to statistics showing homeschooled kids scored higher on standardized tests. They showcased homeschool graduates who won spelling bees and got into prestigious colleges. They created a narrative that homeschooling was academically superior and spiritually protective. The movement exploded. By the early 2000s, over 1 million children were being homeschooled, the vast majority in evangelical Christian families. Entire industries developed around it. Christian homeschool curriculum companies, homeschool conventions, homeschool co-ops, homeschool sports leagues. It became a lifestyle and identity, a badge of faithful parenting. If you really loved your children and took your faith seriously, you homeschooled. That was the message. The vision was beautiful. Families learning together. Parents discipling their children daily. Kids protected from corruption. Faith and education integrated seamlessly. But the reality was often very different. The first signs of trouble appeared in the late 2000s. Young adults who'd been homeschooled started blogging about their experiences. The stories weren't what the movement expected. They talked about educational neglect where parents who weren't qualified to teach struggled with advanced subjects. Science education that was mostly biblical creationism. History taught through a Christian nationalist lens. Math instruction that stopped when parents couldn't help anymore. They talked about isolation, being cut off from peers outside the homeschool bubble, missing normal social development, struggling in college because they'd never learned to navigate diverse environments. They talked about spiritual abuse, authoritarian parenting justified by selective scripture, purity culture that created shame and dysfunction, obsessive focus on obedience and submission, girls trained to be submissive wives rather than independent thinkers. The homeschool community initially dismissed these voices as outliers. Every system has failures, they said. These were just bitter kids blaming their parents for personal problems. But the voices multiplied. Blogs became websites. Websites became networks. By the mid-2010s, there were organized communities of homeschool alumni speaking out about systemic problems in Christian homeschooling. The Homeschool Alumni Reaching Out organization formed to support those who'd been harmed. The Coalition for Responsible Home Education started advocating for better homeschool oversight and accountability. Former homeschoolers wrote books detailing the darker side of the movement. What started as scattered complaints became a chorus of criticism. And the criticism wasn't coming from outsiders. It was coming from the children the movement raised. The success stories who were supposed to validate the model were instead exposing its failures. Then came the documentaries. Jesus Camp showed the intensity of evangelical children's indoctrination. Shiny Happy People exposed the Duggar family and the toxic teachings of Bill Gothard's homeschool empire. Suddenly, what happened in isolated Christian homeschool families was visible to mainstream America. The homeschool movement that once celebrated its distinctiveness now faced public scrutiny. And what the scrutiny revealed was disturbing. Subscribe now if you're starting to see the scope of this crisis, because we need to investigate what specifically went wrong. Let's start with the most obvious problem. Many Christian homeschoolers didn't receive adequate education. The movement promised educational superiority. The reality was often educational neglect. Here's what happened. Parents with no teaching training decided they could educate their children through high school in all subjects. Most managed elementary education reasonably well. But by middle school and high school, many parents were in over their heads. A woman named Jennifer told me her story. Her mother homeschooled her and her 5 siblings using curriculum from Abeka and Bob Jones University Press. The elementary years were fine. But starting in 7th grade, the education fell apart. Her mother didn't understand algebra, so Jennifer taught herself from the textbook. She got stuck constantly and had no one to help. By geometry, she gave up on math entirely. Her mother didn't push it because she believed girls didn't need advanced math anyway. Science was creation science. Biology was about proving evolution wrong. Her chemistry curriculum was Christian-based and scientifically inadequate. She had no physics at all. History was American history from a Christian nationalist perspective. World history was mostly biblical history. She learned nothing about Asian history, African history, or Latin American history beyond European colonization. When Jennifer went to community college at 19, she had to take remedial math. Her science knowledge was so poor that she struggled in basic biology. She felt humiliated and underprepared. She said my parents genuinely believed they were giving me a superior education, but they weren't. They gave me an education full of gaps that I'm still filling in my 30s. And when I try to talk to them about it, they get defensive and say I'm ungrateful. Jennifer's story isn't unique. Homeschool graduates regularly report educational deficiencies in math, science, history, and writing. The problem is structural. Most parents aren't qualified to teach high school-level courses. Christian homeschool curriculum often prioritizes ideology over academic rigor. There's no quality control, no accountability, no standardized assessment to ensure kids are actually learning. The movement's promise of educational superiority was, for many families, a complete lie. Beyond educational failure, Christian homeschooling created profound social isolation. The movement celebrated this isolation. They called it protecting children from worldly influence. In practice, it meant raising kids in echo chambers where they never encountered different perspectives, diverse people, or ideas that challenged their upbringing. Homeschooled kids often had limited social interaction outside their immediate family and church. Their friends were other homeschool kids from similar backgrounds. They attended homeschool co-ops where everyone believed the same things. This wasn't socialization. This was isolation disguised as community. Perhaps no aspect of Christian homeschooling caused more damage than purity culture. Purity culture was the sexual ethic taught in most conservative homeschool families. It emphasized virginity until marriage, modesty to prevent causing men to lust, courtship instead of dating, and patriarchal gender roles. Books like I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris shaped an entire generation's understanding of sexuality. Conferences like True Love Waits had teenagers pledge virginity. Purity rings, father-daughter purity balls, and intense focus on sexual morality dominated homeschool culture. For girls especially, purity culture was devastating. They were taught that their value depended on their virginity, that they were like chewed gum or used tape if they had sex before marriage, that their bodies were stumbling blocks for men and therefore they needed to cover up and guard their behavior constantly. They were taught submission to fathers and future husbands. Many weren't allowed to go to college or have careers because their purpose was marriage and motherhood. One woman named Sarah told me that she was taught she was a sexual threat to men just by existing. That if a man lusted after her, it was her fault for not being modest enough. She was 13. She developed early and was told to wear baggy clothes and be careful around men. She was sexualized and shamed simultaneously. She said purity culture gave her crippling shame about her body and sexuality that took years of therapy to undo. When she did get married, she struggled with intimacy because she'd been taught sex was dangerous and her body was shameful. The purity culture that was supposed to protect her actually damaged her. Joshua Harris, who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, eventually apologized and said the book caused harm. He renounced purity culture. He left Christianity entirely. His journey mirrors thousands of homeschool graduates. The purity culture that was supposed to create healthy sexuality created shame, dysfunction, and trauma instead. Underlying much of Christian homeschooling was authoritarian parenting theology. Many homeschool families followed teachings from people like Michael and Debbie Pearl, whose book To Train Up a Child advocated hitting children with plumbing line to ensure obedience. Or James Dobson, who emphasized parental authority and strict discipline. Or Bill Gothard, whose Advanced Training Institute taught extreme submission to authority. The theology was simple. Children are sinful and rebellious by nature. Parents must break their will and train them to obey absolutely. Questioning authority is rebellion. Independent thinking is dangerous. Submission is the highest virtue. This created homes where abuse was often normalized. Physical punishment for minor infractions. Emotional manipulation through shame and guilt. Spiritual abuse through misused scripture. Many homeschool graduates describe their homes as authoritarian environments where their thoughts, feelings, and choices were controlled. Where asking questions was seen as disrespect. Where disagreeing with parents was sin. One man said his father quoted children obey your parents constantly, but he ignored fathers do not provoke your children to anger. Everything was about obedience to him. His feelings, thoughts, and desires didn't matter. He was supposed to submit and obey. He said it took years to realize that this wasn't Christianity. It was authoritarianism with Bible verses slapped on it. The authoritarian parenting created either broken adults who struggled with independent decision-making or rebellious adults who rejected everything their parents taught them. Either way, it didn't create the faithful, strong Christians the movement promised. No discussion of Christian homeschooling's failures is complete without mentioning Bill Gothard. Gothard founded the Institute in Basic Life Principles and the Advanced Training Institute, which provided curriculum and conferences for homeschool families. At his peak in the 1990s and 2000s, hundreds of thousands of families followed his teachings. Gothard taught extreme patriarchy, absolute submission to authority, and bizarre rules about everything from music to hair length. His curriculum emphasized obedience over education. His vision created homes where fathers had absolute authority and mothers and children were expected to submit without question. The Duggar family, featured on 19 Kids and Counting, were Gothard followers. Their TV show presented Christian homeschooling as wholesome and admirable. Then Josh Duggar's sexual abuse of his sisters was exposed. Then his pornography addiction and infidelity. Then his conviction for possessing child sexual abuse material. The Duggar story became a symbol of Christian homeschooling's darkest secrets. The abuse that was hidden. The dysfunction that was normalized. The failures that were covered up. Gothard himself was accused by dozens of women of sexual harassment and abuse. His ministry collapsed, but the damage he did to thousands of families through his teachings remains. Many homeschool graduates describe Gothard's teachings as cultic. They created environments where abuse flourished, where women and children had no voice, where questioning was impossible. And because these families were isolated, because homeschooling meant no outside oversight, the abuse often continued for years without intervention. Subscribe now if you're understanding why so many homeschool graduates are angry and traumatized, because we need to examine why they're leaving faith entirely. So why are homeschool graduates leaving Christianity in such large numbers? Let me share what they told me. First, they were taught that Christianity and their specific subculture were the same thing. Being Christian meant being conservative, Republican, homeschooled, believing in purity culture, submission to authority, young earth creationism, and Christian nationalism. When they encountered Christians who didn't believe all those things, or when they realized those beliefs didn't hold up under scrutiny, they concluded Christianity itself was false. One woman said she was taught that if evolution was true, Christianity was false. When she studied biology in college and realized evolution was true, she thought she had to abandon Christianity. It took years to realize she could be Christian and accept science. Her parents set up a false dichotomy that almost destroyed her faith. Second, they experienced or witnessed abuse that was justified by Christianity. Physical abuse justified by spare the rod, spoil the child. Emotional abuse justified by parental authority. Spiritual abuse through purity culture and authoritarian control. When Christianity was the justification for their trauma, rejecting Christianity felt like healing. Third, they realized their education was inadequate and their worldview was false. They'd been taught that the earth was 6,000 years old, that America was a Christian nation, that LGBTQ people chose to be gay, that women were naturally submissive. When they learned these things weren't true, they lost trust in everything their parents taught them, including faith. Fourth, they saw hypocrisy. Parents who preached purity culture while covering up sexual abuse. Churches that emphasized family values while protecting abusers. Leaders who taught submission while wielding authority abusively. The gap between what was preached and what was practiced destroyed credibility. The homeschool exodus is deeply connected to the deconstruction movement in evangelicalism. Deconstruction is the process of examining and often dismantling the beliefs and practices of one's religious upbringing. For homeschool graduates, deconstruction often begins in college or early adulthood when they first encounter different perspectives. Social media has amplified this. Homeschool survivors connect online, share stories, validate each other's experiences, and collectively process trauma. Hashtags like Evangelical and Homeschool Survivor have thousands of posts. Podcasts, blogs, and YouTube channels created by former homeschoolers document their deconstruction journeys. They're articulate, thoughtful, and often heartbreaking. Some deconstruct and reconstruct, finding versions of Christianity that don't include the toxic elements of their upbringing. They become progressive Christians, finding churches that affirm LGBTQ people, ordain women, and practice justice-oriented faith. Others deconstruct all the way out of Christianity. They become agnostic, atheist, or spiritual but not religious. They conclude that Christianity itself is inherently problematic and cannot be separated from the abuse they experienced. The deconstruction content is compelling, especially to other homeschool graduates who recognize their own experiences. This creates a snowball effect. As more people deconstruct publicly, others feel permission to do the same. Parents who homeschooled watch in horror as their children reject everything they taught them. They often blame secular culture, college professors, or Satan. They rarely examine whether their methods were flawed. This creates further division. Homeschool graduates feel unseen and unheard by parents who won't acknowledge the harm done. So they disconnect entirely, which confirms their parents' fears that they've been deceived by the world. How many homeschool graduates are actually leaving? Hard data is difficult to obtain because homeschool populations aren't systematically tracked. But available research and surveys paint a concerning picture for the movement. One study of adults who were homeschooled found that approximately 40% were no longer evangelical Christians. Some remained Christian but changed traditions. Many left faith entirely. Among those who remained evangelical, many chose not to homeschool their own children, indicating dissatisfaction with their own education. Another survey of homeschool alumni found that over half reported negative experiences with homeschooling. Common complaints included educational inadequacy, social isolation, and religious trauma. The Coalition for Responsible Home Education, founded by homeschool alumni, has documented hundreds of cases of severe educational neglect and abuse in homeschool families. The homeschool movement's claim that their method would produce superior Christians who'd transform culture has been empirically disproven. Instead, they produced a generation of traumatized young adults, many of whom want nothing to do with the faith or the movement. The irony is profound. The method designed to protect faith became a primary reason people lost faith. Subscribe now if you're seeing the full tragedy of this failure, because we need to examine what lessons Christians should learn. The Christian homeschool movement made fundamental theological errors that produced the exodus. Error 1, they confused cultural preferences with Christianity. Being conservative, Republican, and traditional wasn't Christianity. It was a cultural expression that they elevated to gospel status. When that culture was questioned, people thought they were questioning Christianity itself. Error 2, they created a fortress mentality. Instead of teaching children to engage culture as salt and light, they taught them to hide from culture. This produced adults who couldn't handle diversity, disagreement, or different perspectives. Error 3, they emphasized control over discipleship. True discipleship develops internal faith and independent relationship with God. The homeschool movement emphasized external control and conformity. This produced either rebels or dependent adults who couldn't think for themselves. Error 4, they weaponized Scripture. Bible verses were used to justify control, abuse, and suppression of questions. This taught people that the Bible was a tool of oppression rather than a source of freedom and life. Error 5, they prioritized ideology over education. Truth wasn't what could be proven or demonstrated. Truth was what aligned with their ideology. This created profound mistrust when people discovered they'd been taught falsehoods. What should Christian parents learn from the homeschool exodus? Lesson 1, your children are not projects to control but people to disciple. Discipleship means teaching them to think, question, and develop their own relationship with God. Control produces either rebellion or dependence, not mature faith. Lesson 2, isolation doesn't protect faith. Faith that can't survive questions and different perspectives isn't real faith. Expose your children to diverse ideas and teach them how to think critically while remaining rooted in truth. Lesson 3, education matters. If you homeschool, take education seriously. If you're not qualified to teach advanced subjects, hire tutors or use online courses. Don't let ideology trump academic rigor. Lesson 4, your culture isn't Christianity. Separate core Christian beliefs from cultural preferences. Your children can be faithful Christians without sharing all your political views, musical preferences, or lifestyle choices. Lesson 5, listen to your adult children. If your grown kids tell you that your parenting harmed them, don't dismiss it. Listen, apologize, learn. Your defensiveness will drive them further away. Lesson 6, avoid authoritarian parenting. The goal isn't producing obedient children but mature disciples. Encourage questions. Allow disagreement. Respect their developing autonomy. Lesson 7, if you caused harm, own it. Many homeschool parents genuinely believed they were doing right. But good intentions don't erase harm. If your methods hurt your children, acknowledge it and seek reconciliation. What's the future of Christian homeschooling? The movement is contracting. The exodus of graduates has damaged its reputation. Increasing public scrutiny of homeschool abuse has led to calls for more regulation. The promises that attracted families are now viewed skeptically. But homeschooling itself isn't disappearing. Many families homeschool for legitimate educational reasons unrelated to religious isolation. Some homeschool graduates had positive experiences and choose to homeschool their own kids differently. The future likely involves more accountability. More states are requiring testing, curriculum approval, or home visits. Homeschool organizations are pushing back, but public pressure is growing. We'll also see continued exodus. As more homeschool graduates speak out, others will feel empowered to do the same. The deconstruction movement shows no signs of slowing. For evangelicalism, the homeschool exodus is a major crisis. An entire generation raised in the faith is rejecting it. These aren't kids who never heard the gospel. They're kids who were intensely indoctrinated in Christian faith and practice. Their departure raises profound questions about evangelical methods, theology, and culture. 2 million children raised in the Christian homeschool movement, supposed to be the generation that took back America for Christ. Instead, they're leaving, not quietly, not apologetically, but publicly, articulately, and in numbers that represent a generational repudiation of everything the movement stood for. The homeschool exodus is one of the most significant failures in modern evangelical history, not because homeschooling itself is wrong, but because the movement turned education into indoctrination, parenting into control, and Christianity into cultural isolation. They promised to raise strong Christians. They often produced traumatized ex-Christians. Here's what breaks my heart. Many homeschool parents genuinely loved their children. They sacrificed enormously to homeschool. They believed they were doing the right thing. But love without wisdom can cause profound harm. Good intentions without humility can produce disaster. The homeschool movement was so certain they were right that they couldn't see the damage they were doing. When their children tried to tell them, they dismissed it as rebellion or worldly deception. Now those children are adults, and they're speaking truth that the movement doesn't want to hear. You failed us. Your methods harmed us. Your theology wounded us. And we're walking away. The exodus is accelerating. Every documentary, every podcast, every blog post from homeschool survivors reaches others who recognize their own story. The silence is breaking. The secrets are being told. For evangelicalism, this should be a moment of profound repentance and reflection. What did we do wrong? How did we cause this much damage while believing we were being faithful? What must change? But too often, the response is defensiveness, denial, blame shifting. This will only accelerate the exodus. If this investigation challenged you, convicted you, or helped you understand someone's story, subscribe now. Share this with parents who need to hear it. And if you're a homeschool graduate processing your experience, know that your story matters. Your pain is real. Your anger is justified. And you're not alone. The homeschool movement failed a generation. The question now is whether the church will learn from that failure or repeat it. May we choose wisdom over certainty. May we choose humility over defensiveness. May we choose our children's well-being over our ideological commitments. That's the call. That's the challenge. The homeschool exodus is teaching us whether we're willing to listen.